This episode of Around the Layout is brought to you by Highball Graphics. For over 25 years, Highball Graphics has been providing high-quality decals for railroads in New England, Canada, and beyond. With over 2,000 sets in scales N through G, Highball Graphics has you and your project covered. Highball Graphics specializes in custom decal orders, serving freelance railroads worldwide. Check out their easy-to-use website at highballgraphics.com or email them at info@highballgraphics.com. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Around the Layout, where model railroaders come to tell their story. My name is Ray Arnott. So glad you could join us on tonight's episode. For coming to us from Central Massachusetts, John Razuk. John, welcome to the show.
So glad to be here. How's it going?
It's going great, John. I'm glad we were able to connect here. You and I met a while back at one of the hobby shows, and you know, I came to notice your project of the HO scale Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus train. And when the podcast hit, and I think we saw each other at the Worcester show. Was that the last time we saw each other?
Yeah, that was when we officially connected, and you asked me to be on the show, and I agreed. So yeah, that was the last time I think we connected.
And you had the train running there. I think Amherst was there, right? And you had it on their layout.
That was back in, I believe, 2019 or 2020.
Okay.
Was when it ran on their layout.
Okay, so you were just visiting this last time around back in, when the heck was it? In February, I think it was, right?
Yeah, I was just there checking out the show with my dad.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. Well, I'm glad we were able to talk then, because I wanted to get you on the podcast. You were one of the guys on the list because you've got something really interesting going on with this circus train, and definitely a story to tell. So I'm looking forward to getting into it and hearing how you've gotten yourself to where you are now. But let's start in the beginning. I want to know where the adventure begins for you in model railroading. How'd you get into the hobby?
So I've asked my parents this question, kind of like, how did it all start? Where did the interest in trains really begin? As far as I know, I've been interested in trains in general since the age of 2, which for me was back in 1997. We don't really know the exact event that sparked the interest. Some of the ones that I can remember off the top of my head was when I was younger, both my parents would work, so I would stay with my grandparents. And my grandfather, not really knowing at the time how to entertain a toddler, had some VHS tapes. He didn't have anything specifically geared for kids. Not saying it was inappropriate. It was absolutely not, but he had one VHS tape in his collection, and that was America by Rail, The Heartland, by Greg Scholl's Video Productions. And the first time seeing the images of trains really sparked an interest with me. And then the other event I remember where my interest in trains began was at a neighbor's Christmas party. And they had 2 sons, one of which was my older sister's age, and one was about my age. And he had some of the Tomy, the Thomas trains on the floor. And I started playing with them, and then the interest just kind of grew from there. And once my parents realized that, hey, this is something he's interested in, let's let it grow. I started getting, the Thomas merchandise, the VHS tapes and the wooden railway. My dad and my grandfather would bring me into Worcester in the evenings to watch the rush of commuter trains and Amtrak trains. And at the time, Conrail was still in its final years before the CSX takeover. So that's kind of where the interest in trains began. The first time I had my hands on like actual models was my dad, when he was younger, had gotten some of the Tycho sets, and he decided to share them with me. At the time, I was obviously not old enough to really be able to handle them. A lot of them ended up breaking. But the nice thing about it was that as I got older, I started to learn how to rebuild them. I would pick them up and say, okay, this needs new wheels or this needs new couplers. And that's kind of how I started really honing in my skills as a model railroader. As a kid, I would cycle on my bedroom floor right behind me between different train sets that I would get either for Christmas or for my birthday. Sometimes out of the year, it would be Thomas the Tank Engine, just the wooden railway around the floor. Other times, it would be a small N-scale set. Other times, it would be a lifelike set. And then eventually, I would start to purchase actual Atlas, pieces of track and curves. And then I started kind of becoming a model railroader by, just putting things together. I didn't have anything in terms of like scenery that I would buy at the store. So I would improvise with like big rocks I found outside for mountains and toilet paper tubes for like chimney stacks. And I would recycle things from the Thomas set, as buildings and just anything I could put together. That's kind of how it all really began, becoming a model railroader. And it wasn't until I was in high school that I began to relocate my set in our basement, and I started to actually build a benchwork and actually started to have an actual layout.
Where did you start to transition there? It was first. Let me say it's really cool. Your parents were fostering this and noticed that it was something you were really into and helped you along with it. But when you get into that high school age and you're starting this bench work, where did you start to get those ideas? What as far as bench work and doing all that, what guided that?
Well, what sparked it was I have seasonal allergies, and I had a carpet that would collect dust, and I had terrible allergies, and we assumed, okay, well, the carpet can't be good for him. So we had to rip up the carpet, and I would be left with a wood floor. And that wasn't the best setup for a layout. So they decided, well, since we can't walk around your room anyways, to get anywhere, because I had track everywhere, all over the room and all over the floor. They could not walk around to try to do anything. So they said, you know what? We have some space in the corner of our basement. Let's move the trains down there. And rather than them being on the floor, my grandfather is a carpenter. They said, his grandfather can build him some bench work, and we can start to put the layout up on an actual table. And it took a while to get the bench work up. The layout was initially about 10 by 12 feet. I was able to do a simple curve, some yard area, and as I started building, then I said, well, I need some more realistic scenery. So that's when I would visit my local hobby store. At the time, it was Henry's Hobby House in West Boylston. Unfortunately, they're no longer around. But that's where I would start to pick up buildings, and I would start to pick up trees and ballast. And I had already been a subscriber of Model Railroader. So then I was starting to kind of look at the pictures and say, okay, this is what I want it to look like. And then I just had to make it happen. And I've always been a great eye for detail. So I just said, okay, like I know what I want to look like. I just have to make it happen. And then I would just go and I would just start laying things out. And obviously beforehand, I had done drawings of kind of what I wanted the layout to look like and the different buildings that I wanted to have and so forth.
I, in pre-show research, I kind of, I guess I call it Facebook creeping, but I call it pre-show research. I don't know which one you want to, I like to call it pre-show research, but I noticed that you have kind of other artistic stuff. You were into music, and did you have that artistic mindset early on? Because I think it all kind of is relative, whether it be a music art or painting or model railroading. I think it's all in that same artistic mind.
Yeah, and I get that mainly from my mom's side of the family. She was an artist. She started off doing, she would do what was, early retouching. So this is like pre-Photoshop. What she would do is she would go to a studio and they would take a photograph of, let's say it was like a Supreme Court judge, or it was like, a police officer or someone prominent. And rather than giving them the photograph, they wanted to create a portrait, a painting from that picture. So she would have to take that picture and she would have to paint over the picture to create a
Oh.
painting, and anything that they wanted removed, like blemishes or scars or anything, she would have to physically paint that out. And I think that just kind of transitioned over to myself in terms of just the artistic side of me. My mom's side of the family had always been musically inclined. My grandparents and my uncles had been pianists, and I became a pianist myself. Not as much now, but when I was younger, I used to do it a lot more. And then me and my siblings, we were singers. We participated in our school choirs, our school musicals. So we were just always very musically and very, artistically inclined. In terms of where the model building came in, I think that comes more from my father's father, my dad's dad, because he used to build World War II and World War One model airplanes, and he would have them all over the ceiling of his basement. And every time I would go over to his house, I would see these models. And that is something else that probably also sparked the interest in modeling.
So what you're saying is you got from the best of both worlds in genetics.
Pretty much.
Yeah, nice. That's really cool. I mean, your mom, that's a really neat. Did she do that as a profession to do this portrait kind of stuff?
Yeah, and then of course when Photoshop became a thing, then she transitioned over to Photoshop. And now
Sure.
what she does is she does interior painting for, people just for like their living room or like their bedroom or something like that. She does interior painting now.
Excellent. And then you said your dad's dad, your grandfather with the model building, and were you able to ever model build with him or kind of share that with him?
No, unfortunately I never got that opportunity to share that hobby with him.
Yeah. But I mean, you were able to at least take that inspiration and then run with it with your own. So, you're in high school, and I hear quite often that, there's a fall off, it seems, around the high school age. Was there one for you?
Not really, because I was, I had, I did other things besides the modeling. My other big passion, my other hobby was martial arts. And that's something else that I would do quite often. And even now, I'm a martial art teacher. I was just there actually a couple hours ago training and teaching. But in terms of model railroading, I think it just accelerated rather than went down. Because by the time I got to high school, the other thing besides modeling was filming and photography. And it was during that time that I really started to become like a rail fan, or a foamer, as people like to call us. And I'll probably, like, towards the end of middle school into high school was when I started to play around with our family's video camera, and I started to experiment with filming. And then, of course, it was at a friend's house that they introduced me to the wonderful world of YouTube. I didn't know what YouTube was. They said, "Oh, you got some videos, let's put them up on YouTube." And I was like, "What's YouTube?" So he showed me YouTube, and soon enough, I had some videos on, and then I found other people's videos. And I'm like, there's other people that also film trains. Like, that's a thing.
Yeah.
And I started meeting people, other, rail fans, and eventually, we would get together, we would film trains together. So the passion just grew rather than, went down during high school. There was really nothing that deterred me from becoming more interested in trains.
Let's talk about the railfanning for a minute. I don't want to pass that by, because that's certainly something that seems to inspire a lot, including myself. So I know you live up right now. You live in like the Worcester metro area, we'll call it, and you grew up in that same area, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. So, I mean, we talk about a great area, and you mentioned some of the railroads. Talk about some of your railfanning. Like, where was your favorite place to go railfanning?
So, being that I had been brought to Worcester, since being a child, that was obviously the place I wanted to be all the time. Probably after school, I would, finish my homework. And then once I had a car and I could drive myself, I would go to Worcester, and I would spend the evening in Worcester, and I would just get whatever came through, whether it be the commuter rail, eventually I would get Amtrak. anything that CSX would bring through. That was my main place to be, was Worcester. And I would eventually, obviously, I would occasionally venture to other locations. Back then, there was still significant freight traffic east of Worcester, so I would go over to Grafton, or I would go to Westboro to see trains moving through there, And the other railroad that piqued my interest as a child, and I was fortunate enough to start watching them when they first came back, was the Grafton-Upton Railroad. As a kid, my older sister went to dance classes in North Grafton, above the post office pub, and the tracks run right past the parking lot. And my mom, knowing that I like trains, would bring me over to the tracks, and just beyond the crossing was the Washington Mills. And sitting outside the mills every time was this green Alco S4 switcher covered up in a blue tarp. And that was the railroad's only motive power. And I would be very intrigued by that locomotive, but I never got to see it run. And then eventually, years later, in 2000, I think it was 2008, was when Deli Priscoli bought the Grafton-Upton and announced that it would be coming back to life. And I immediately started flocking to the Grafton-Upton every chance I got to just see anything moving. So that was another place that I went a lot. I would, during the summer, my family, we would go down to Cape Cod. So I would catch Cape Cod Central when I could. We would go up to North Conway. I would see Conway Scenic. Probably my favorite railroad to Railfan, or one of my favorites, was the Worcester main line from Worcester to Ayer, which now CSX owns after claiming it from Pan Am. And, there was, I remember throughout high school, going back to Worcester, we had, me, my dad, my grandfather, we had a morning routine. And every Sunday, after church, we would pick up my grandfather, and we would take him and myself, we would go over to Worcester, and we would hang out at Union Station for a little while, see if anything went through. We would go over to, at the time, you could still access the east end of the yard off of Putnam Lane, which has now been taken over by the new part of the yard. And we would also go over to the Province and Worcester yard and just cross our fingers we didn't get kicked out. We would go up to the engine house, and I could roam around the yard. And at the time, even when there were people working there, a lot of them were very nice enough to be like, "Oh, you want to come inside and see the shop?" And I would get a chance to go inside and see the engines and take pictures. And then they would tell me like, "Oh, if you're interested, the gardener job's going to be coming back at like 1:00 if you want to go catch them on the branch line." Or, "Oh, there's something that's going to be moving around down to Providence." So those were all the different places that I would flock to. And then as I got older and as I got more, ambitious in my driving capabilities, I would travel even farther away. I would go to Palmer. I would go up to the Berkshires. In college, I went to Fitchburg State University, and I got to see probably the best years of Pan Am Railways while there was still all this foreign traffic coming through. And my best friend was my roommate, and we would get up at at 3:00 in the morning. We would still be up, and we'd be like, "You want to go see trains? Yeah, let's go see trains." We'd go over to Shirley, and we caught one of the last oil trains with like Burlington Northern Santa Fe Power going through. College was when, I got much more like ambitious with my rail fanning.
This roommate that you had at Fitchburg, was this somebody you knew beforehand, or did you meet him at college and find out that he was into trains too?
I knew of him on YouTube and on Facebook, but I didn't really know who he was. His name's Ryan Bullen, and I really met him in college, and he just happened to be a rail fan, so it was perfect that we would become roommates.
Yeah, you lucked into the best type of roommate.
Oh yeah.
So up in Fitchburg, you got to see a lot of really cool stuff out of the Worcester area. You said the rebirth of the Grafton and Upton, and then the stuff that's available to you right there in Worcester with Amtrak, CSX, MBTA, P&W. Yeah, you got to see a lot of stuff, and then of course the Pan Am era, like you mentioned, was that in the Guilford era, or was it kind of more towards the, where they're trying to make it look more like an airline?
That was when they were really starting to make it look more like an airline. So that was like back when like you could guarantee like Union Pacific and like Burlington Northern Santa Fe power coming through regularly on like container trains, and we saw Kansas City Southern come in on grain trains. You would see like all just like the wacky, EMD lash ups and the different paint schemes. So that was just really enjoyable that we got to see all that really cool stuff before things started to go, more of the bland side.
Did you get this all on video too?
Yeah. I have dozens of DVDs that I've burned to like 2-hour long DVDs. I would like to distribute them eventually. It's just my concern is like the copyright stuff.
Gotcha. Yeah, well, I'm sure you got to, I mean, we talk about it a bit, I talk about railfanning and photography, and, I do some photography myself. And, I mentioned on at least a few podcasts that I feel like I missed the golden era, because you're talking about things like that. And, somebody else will say, oh, I got to see, Conrail on the Boston line. And then somebody, I guess, it's always capture what you see right now, because it will be a golden era to somebody. Like, what you're talking about is kind of golden era to me. And, maybe somebody else was upset seeing what you were seeing. They still wanted to see Big Blue, or they wanted to see some other things. But, yeah, it's just always great to capture that. I mean, you've got a period of railroading history all on DVD. So.
Yeah, mostly DVD, and I was fortunate enough to be able to salvage a lot of my high 8 tapes. Probably one of the cooler trains I got on one of the high 8 tapes was back in 2008. I think it was 2008. Good Morning America ran a special train of superliners and a pair of Pennsy private cars, and they brought the train into Worcester, which, to my knowledge, is the first and only time superliners were ever present in the city. And to be able to see superliners up close that far east was just an unbelievable experience, because I knew that it was never going to happen again. It was a one-off thing. I think they wanted to bring the train into Boston, but due to the clearance issues with the superliners, they couldn't do it. So they brought it as far as Worcester.
Didn't they have a special car or special locomotive on that train too? If my
yeah, they had a modified NPCU with like these like two big white dome things and like a bunch of antennas, so they could broadcast straight from the train.
Right. I've seen some video on that. That's pretty wild, and it's awesome you were able to capture that while it was in Worcester.
Yeah, and that's one of the fond memories I have, especially with my grandfather watching trains. So he was there with me and my dad, and that was just a really cool experience to be able to see that.
Absolutely. So we're up in Fitchburg State University. You're Ryan, your roommate. He's into trains as well. You're doing some rail fanning. Are you able to kind of keep the model railroading thing going through college, or?
Yeah. So to kind of go back to rewind a little bit, it was my freshman year, and I actually was at Wentworth. So my freshman year of college, I went to Wentworth in Boston. At the time, I was planning on, I knew I wanted to do something with the railroad, but I didn't really know what. And I thought that maybe business management would be the best route to go. So I went to Fitchburg my freshman year to study business. And living in Boston for me, not really being a big city person, was unbelievably boring. I found it just absolutely boring being in Boston. I tried to do some sightseeing. I tried like visiting some places like the Prudential and Fenway, the Museum of Fine Arts, and I was bored out of my mind. So what I would do is Ruggles Station was right next door. So I would go over there when I didn't have any classes, and I would just railfan the corridor. And then I got caught by the T. They didn't like me having a tripod. So I relocated to Reedville. I would just hop on the T and go over to Reedville, and I saw a lot better things over there. Going back to the railfanning thing. But in my freshman year, when I was in Boston, it was at this point that I had now, as everyone does, this sudden sense of freedom, this sense that it's like I can really do whatever I want. Not necessarily, but I can, I have the potential to do a lot of different things now. And I knew about model railroad clubs at this point. And being as bored as I was and having all this free time, I said, you know what? I want to join a model railroad club. I want to be a part of a club. And knowing that there were clubs around, I just had to say, okay, what clubs do I have access to? And being that as a freshman, you're not allowed to have a car on campus, I could only access clubs that were directly within range of a commuter rail line. So there were 3 different clubs that I could choose from. There was the Bay State Model Railroad Museum in Roslindale, which was accessible off the Needham line of the MBTA. There was the South Shore Club in Hingham, and at the time, I think they were still in their old space near the Hingham station before they moved into the Armory, and via the Greenbush line. And then there was the North Shore Model Railroad Club in Wakefield, which was accessible via the Haverhill line. So I, watched some videos and I looked at, their websites and some Facebook pages just to kind of get an idea of what these clubs were like and what the layouts were like. Because my interest at the time was like, I wanted to be a part of like a big club, like a club with a lot of members, with a really nice layout and a place where I could really open up and run my trains, So my first thought was going to see South Shore. The problem, though, at the time was that if I were to stay on campus on the weekend and I wanted to go to the club, the Greenbush line was not offering MBTA service on the weekends on the Greenbush line. So there would be no way for me during the weekend to be able to visit the club. So I was like, okay, well, South Shore's out. And I had looked at Roslindale, but I wasn't really familiar with how many members they had and what the layout size was. So I decided, you know what? Okay, let me go check out the North Shore Club up in Wakefield. So I would hop the Green Line trolley and go up to North Station. And then at North Station, I would transfer over to the Reading shuttle or the Haverhill Line train. And I went all the way up to Wakefield, and I had to just do a small, short walk down the street to the location of the North Shore Club. And I get there, I go inside, and, a lot of the members are all sitting in the front at the table. And one of our members by the name of, unfortunately, he's no longer around. His name was Wayne Slayton Sr. He was like the club ambassador, and he comes up to me. He's like, "Oh, welcome to the North Shore Model Railroad Club. Let me show you around." And when you first walk into the North Shore Model Railroad Club, you see only 2 peninsulas. And it's not until after you get done seeing those 2 peninsulas that they tell you, oh no, there's more. And you turn the corner and there's like 3 more peninsulas going down towards the back. The North Shore Club the layout is 95 feet by 30 feet. And they're one of the largest clubs in the state of Massachusetts in terms of the number of members and in terms of the layout itself. And eventually I became a member in February of 2014. And it was at this point that I really started to just pretty much just go full blown into model railroading. I have met a lot of great people who have been able to just give me all sorts of advice on how to do all sorts of different things. I got interested in their operations, and now I'm actually I manage their modern operating sessions, as well as I'm the vice president of the club now. Not for long though, because I'm actually not going to be continuing my office position. I'm going to be stepping out of the politics for a little while so I can focus on my career. But it was basically when I joined that club was when I just really started going hardcore into model railroading. And that's part of the story of kind of how the circus train began, was by joining that club.
So before we get to that, I do want to mention, and another thing that I seem to be repeating is the benefits of a club. Tell me a little bit about what your early on takeaways were with the club.
So probably one of the best benefits for me in terms of the club was I now had other people that I could talk to and I could learn from in terms of model railroading. Before, when I was in high school, I didn't have anybody. I had to do it on my own. All I had was, through magazines and my friends who were rail fans, they weren't really big into model railroading at that time. So there wasn't really anyone I could, connect with to really start getting into model railroading or really get advice on how to do things like scenery and rolling stock and detailing and electrical. Not only that, but having a layout at my home, that 10 by 12 foot layout, for me felt kind of restrictive because me being interested in like big long trains and, big mainline stuff like I would see in Worcester, I couldn't really do that with a 10 by 12 foot layout. The layout I had was based off of a fictional short line that I had created, kind of similar to the Grafton Upton in a way, but more leaning on the idea of like tourist operations because I was a fan of like the Cape Cod Central and Conway Scenic and the Hobo and Essex. So being a part of a model railroad club, I now had access to this gargantuan layout, and I pretty much had the full freedom to build as big a train as I wanted, as much as I wanted. And it also gave me the opportunity to just feel a part of the model railroading community. Before, I wasn't really connected to the community in any shape, in any way. I would go to the shows, but I didn't really know anybody. Now, being a part of a club, I now feel like I'm contributing. I'm giving something back to the model railroading community. I'm, providing a service. I'm providing myself and my expertise. And whenever we can bring a new member in, and, I get to share my story and I get to share with them the things that I've learned, it makes me feel that, like, I'm keeping the hobby alive in a way. But, having access to a club, has really been a wonderful thing. And just having a place that I can go and I can enjoy my hobby with other people. And, we always get into like, any rando conversation about, whatever. And it's just great to have that place for us all to kind of be. And it's also been a place for, again, the friends that I had, made Railfanning. We're now all members of the club. So it's another place where we can just all come together and we can just hang out and just, converse with one another about, just kind of how things are going in our lives and whatnot.
Yeah, it's well said. I'm a big proponent of clubs. For those that are looking to get in the hobby, it's a great place to start, as you did. You're living proof of that. And the other side of that is thank goodness for guys like Wayne Slayton Sr. that you mentioned, that here's a guy that would get up from the table and bring somebody new into the club and introduce them to the hobby and introduce them to the club and invite them in with open arms per se. Makes a huge difference. It makes a huge difference, and that's how we're going to move the hobby forward, is guys like that who are willing to extend themselves. So that's fantastic. And then look at what happened. From that moment, you roll yourself in through the club, and eventually find yourself with a title and contributing to the club as vice president, and then running the op sessions, and that's how it's done. That's a great example of how it should be.
Yep, absolutely. So, and, I know like there's always going to be people that have their angsts about clubs, and even myself, there's obviously things about clubs that aren't too great, like the politics, and when there's like members who want to do things their way and not, let anyone else like contribute or do anything. It's going to happen with any organization, regardless if it's model railroading or if it's sports related or if it's art, whatever group that you're in, you're always going to have those issues, and you can't let that deter you from wanting to become a member of any kind of organization.
Yeah, the only way to fix that is you remove the humans, right? That if you could remove the humans from all organizations, you wouldn't have the politics. But it comes with the territory. But the gains are definitely there. If you can get beyond that, and there's a lot of great things to benefit from a club and a lot of great takeaways. But I want to get into this here because you mentioned about the circus train. So how does that start to develop?
Okay, so the story of the circus train, how it kind of came to be. So for that, I really have to go way back, much further back before model railroading or before the club, really. So people have asked me this question a lot. They ask me like, "Oh, were you a big fan of the circus before you modeled the train?" And as much as I want to say yes, that is the case, that actually is not the case. Did I hate the circus? No, absolutely not. I went to when I was a kid. When the show would come to town, it was just another thing that my parents, and I and my siblings could do. It was just another thing to do. So we would go see the show when it came to Worcester. I think we only went to see the show really like 2 times when I was a kid. And, I loved the show. I thought it was great seeing, all the different performances and seeing the animals and whatnot. But it wasn't something at that time that, like, I begged my parents to go see. It wasn't like something like I was like, oh my God, like the circus is in town. We have to go. It was just another thing to do at that time. And in terms of the trains, I actually, at that time, I didn't even know a circus train existed. I had seen pictures, so I knew that, something existed, but I didn't really know that that was like a thing. I had seen Dumbo, so I knew, oh, there's something called a circus train, and like it's like a train that carries the circus.
Right.
And I had seen like pictures and photographs, and so I knew that they existed. Actually, yeah, so I knew they existed. I just had never seen it. Because usually when the circus train would come to Worcester, a lot of the times they would come in at night, or they would come in under the cover of darkness, and you never really saw it.
Yeah.
And they, at the time, were no longer parking the train over near Union Station. They would park over at the Province of Worcester yard, or they would park somewhere on the P&W's property, usually somewhere where it wasn't really too accessible to the public. So the first time I was introduced to circus model trains was actually at the 2002 Amherst Hobby Show. It was my very first time going to the show, and I had been to hobby shows before, but nothing on that level of just immensity and just because you've been to the show, and for anybody who's been to the Amherst Railway Hobby Show, it is one of, if not the largest model train shows in the country. They take up 4 large buildings of the Eastern States Exposition, and I think the most amount of people I think they've seen is like 25,000 people. I know this past show, I think they saw in terms of both days was like around 21,000. So it's one of the largest shows. And as a young kid, that just like I was on just like overload. It was absolute overload at that for me at that age. I think I was 7 years old at the time. Just absolute overload seeing that many trains at that one time. And we went in, and I forget exactly which building we went into first, but the first building we went into, we came across the N track, the and Northeast N track module group, and there was one set of modules there, and he's still around. His name is Roland Kelly. He still brings his modules to the shows, and he had set up this large scene of the circus train. And he's done the classic era train, but he also has done the modern era train. He doesn't bring it out that often, but I have been able to get photographs of it since. He had this setup of just the Ringling Brothers circus train in N scale, and nearby was a full display case of just circus models. And I saw those, and I was just in awe of this. I was like, I'd never seen anything like that before. It wasn't anything that I was familiar with, and it was just like, wow, like this is really cool. I've never seen anything like this before. So, years go by. I don't think I saw him until many, many years later. But so years go by, and I start model railroading. Like I said, in my basement, I had a layout. And I was just modeling at the time, just things that I saw, things that I liked. I but just generic modern rolling stock, just box cars, tank cars, hoppers. I had a couple P&W locomotives, some CSX locomotives, and then I would buy some other just more classic era engines that I thought would look nice on like an excursion train. And I hadn't really defined any specific railroad or anything like in terms of modeling, because people will ask you like, oh, like what do you model? What railroad do you model? I didn't really have a specific one. I like Conrail, because I'd seen Conrail, so I have a bunch of Conrail engines. I have some P&W, I had some P&Ws, but I wasn't really fixed on any kind of like thing specifically. And it wasn't until like high school and college that I started to kind of play around with customizing models, specifically for this fictional tourist train idea that I had come up with, which I dubbed, actually, it's called the Lake Quinsigamond Railroad. And I kind of based it off of just my area, because I live right outside of Worcester and Shrewsbury. And we have the lake, which separates, the city from Shrewsbury. And I just thought, it'd be kind of neat if a railroad had paralleled the river, like right up against the water. And that's kind of where the idea for the fictional Lake Quinsigamond came from. And so I had started customizing cars, and it was more, high school into college that I began to actually customize passenger cars. I wanted to do a dinner train because, I had been familiar with the Cape Cod Central dinner train. There was a dinner train on Newport, and I had seen pictures of other dinner trains, and I wanted to build a dinner train. So I started to customize not only the exterior of the passenger cars, but the interiors. I would remove the Walthers from Walthers cars. I removed the Walthers interiors, and I would put down my own floors, my own tables, and all the, even like the wallpaper and, pictures on the walls, and just all the tables with the, coverings and the napkins and the plates and everything. And I went all out and I built this dinner train. And this was the foreshadowing into the circus train, because the circus not only is the freight equipment, but it's the passenger car. So this is kind of the precursor to the circus train, was starting and just detailing passenger cars for a fictional tourist train. So when I got to the North Shore Railroad Club, I had this large layout accessible to me. In my mind, I was thinking, okay, I want to not only build a big train, but I want to challenge myself as a modeler. I want to take it to the next level. How far can I go with a big project? And I, in my mind, thought, okay, I want to build a big train, something that fits on this huge layout. I want to build something passenger related, because I had already been doing passenger car customization. And I wanted it to be something that people could connect with, something that when people saw it running around, it was like, ooh, that's really cool. Or like, ooh, like, oh my God, I remember that. Or like, oh, that's new. That's different. That was the thing, is I wanted something different. I wanted something that no one else was doing. So in my mind, I kind of sat down. I was like, okay, what kind of train could I do? Like, what had I seen? What would be really cool that not a lot of people had, or not a lot of people saw? So in my mind, I said, okay, let me think. By this point, I had been doing research into like all different aspects of railroad history. So I thought, okay, I could do the Freedom Train. That would be kind of cool. I know that some cars have been done, but not like heavily detailed cars. So I thought, the Freedom Train, that would be kind of cool to do. People would connect to that. My family has a military background, so I thought, maybe like a military train would be kind of cool to do, with like, flat cars and like, all the armored vehicles and something like that. And I thought, that would be kind of neat. I thought, the American Orient Express, that would be really cool, because no one's really done that before, with like more detailed passenger cars. And I just kind of in my head had all these ideas of things that I wanted to do. And by this point, I had seen the circus train in person. That was back in high school. having access to the internet, I was able to access at the time Yahoo groups that tracked where the circus train was and where it was going. And I finally found out when it would be coming to Worcester. And all I had to do was just kind of keep checking for updates when that circus train would come by. And eventually I was able to figure out that, okay, it would be coming from Manchester, New Hampshire, going to Worcester. And as I had to keep on checking my updates, even there, like I actually, before I went to school, I was trackside waiting for that train to go by, and I never saw it. So at that point I had to give in, go to school, and just hope that I hadn't missed it. Well, thankfully by 2:00, by the time I got out of school, it hadn't gone through yet. It was still up somewhere on Pan Am, because knowing Guilford, and I had been told this now by circus employees, that Guilford, they hated Guilford. They hated every time they had to run on Guilford, because Guilford was always late with their crews. They would be scheduled to leave Manchester at like 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, and the crew would not arrive until like way past the afternoon. So I was in luck. The train would not be arriving in Worcester until about 6 o'clock that evening. So I run over to Worcester, sat for a couple hours, and finally at around 6 o'clock, out of the hospital tunnel comes the blue unit train, pulled by, I think, like one Pan Am unit and like 3 Guilford units. And that was really the first time I got to see the full train up close in person. And watching that train go by, seeing not only just the train, but the people. That was the thing about the circus train, was the people. The people, they would come out to their vestibules and they would wave to you and they would holler and like, you know, shout out to you like, oh my God, like we're here, come see the show. And then you would see all the flat cars and, you know, all the loads. And I thought that was the coolest thing. So in my mind, as I was coming up with ideas for a train, I thought to myself, you know what? No one's really done the modern circus train before, because people had done classic era circus trains, like during the tent era, as I refer to it, you know,
Sure.
the classic circus train with like the wooden stock cars and like, you know, wooden passenger cars and like the really fancy looking wagons. Like people had done those in the past, but no one had really done the modern circus train. We can talk more about that later, like the difference between a classic and the modern. No one had really done the modern train yet. And I thought to myself, you know what? That would be really cool to do. It's something different. It's something that you don't normally see. It's something unique. It's something that people can connect with. And I said to myself, you know what? Like that would be really cool. That's what I want to do. I want to model the circus train. So I announced it to everybody. I'm like, you know, like this is what I want to do. I want to model the circus train. And all my buddies come up to me and they're like, you're going to model the circus train? Yeah. Good luck with that. Yeah. Do you have any idea how incredibly costly that's going to be? Like, yeah, good luck with that. Yeah. You go do that. And, you know, I'm thinking to myself like, okay, you know, they are right. You know, it's like, this is going to be an insanely expensive project. Like, how am I going to be able to do this? And it wasn't long after I had started to kind of look at pictures of the train and how I was going to do it. It wasn't long after that January 2017 comes along and we got that announcement from Feld Entertainment saying Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus will be no more by spring of 2017. And as soon as I heard that announcement, in my mind, I knew this is a sign. In my mind, I knew there are no more doubts. There's no more, should I do it? Is it too costly? At that point, I was like, no, I have to do this now. That was the moment where I was like, I have to do this. I have to model that train, because when that curtain closes for the last time and that train is all sold off and gone, there's not going to be anything left to represent what that train was, all connected as one solid piece and what it stood for. So at that point I was like, I have to do it. It's not a question of if, it's like I have to. It had to be done. someone had to do it. And if anyone was going to do it, like, it was going to be me. Like,
Yes.
that train had to come into existence.
So yeah, you're capturing history and you're capturing a memory, really, of being able to see it. And absolutely. So the process begins, and I know, where does the research part, where does that take you? Because you said that you'd been to the circus a few times, you had seen the train, you've done some online research to know where it is, but as far as getting to know what that train was, talk about that process a bit.
So that, and so in, for future sake, and if anybody out there is ever interested in modeling any kind of train, always start with the research. Know what it is and what it looks like and all the details before you get into the project. If you want it to be like super accurate, like as close to the real thing as you want it to, as you can. So it all kind of, so at that point, that was when I started I came up, so the first thing I did was I came up with a list. I said, okay, like, this is the list of like every single car that I want to make, in what order the train would be built, and how much it was going to cost, like, per car. And before I could do that, I had to say, okay, is there anything out there that is produced by a model railroad manufacturer that is what I want? And for people out there who are wondering, is there anything out there that says Ringling Brothers on it? Is there anything out there that I can just slap together and be like, oh, this is the train? Yes and no. So if you're modeling N scale, you're in luck, because Micro Trains did do the Ringling Brothers, and they did a fairly good job of it. The problem is that the models can be hard to find. And unfortunately, I don't think they're allowed to produce it anymore because I don't think they have the proper licensing. And if you're an HO modeler, you're kind of in luck, but not really, because Bachmann does have the rights to do rolling stock with the name Ringling Brothers on it. But they, rather than taking the actual prototype, they just took their standard passenger car and just painted it and just slapped the logo on. And so you can have a car that says Ringling Brothers on it, but it's not going to be very close to what it actually really was prototypically, if you want it to be prototypical. So I kind of said to myself, okay, is there anything out there produced by a model manufacturer that is as close to the real prototype as you can get? And thankfully, the answer is yes. You can find cars that look like the Ringling Brothers cars. And part of the research also included, okay, well, first, before I really know what cars I have to buy, I need to know exactly what kind of cars did Ringling use? What kind of cars did they have? And how did they get them, and how did they make them look like what they did? And that all goes back to the 1960s and the 1970s, when the Ringling Brothers, so mid-50s was when Ringling Brothers stopped doing the tent shows, and they transitioned over to doing arena shows in indoor arenas. And actually, before they, at the time they dropped the tent, they also decided for a short period of time to drop the train. So they retired the train and decided to travel by road. And that was not the best choice to make, because they found that to be incredibly costly, and it was very slow, and they, couldn't, obviously they had to deal with any kind of weather extremes. So like, the snow or mud or rain. So it was just incredibly costly. And they said, you know what, screw this. We're going back to the train, but we're going to start, now that we have, these arena shows, we're going to rebuild the train, because the old train was starting to get a little rough. So thankfully, in the 1960s, as a lot of railroaders know, passenger railroading wasn't really doing so well. All these name trains, this is obviously before Amtrak came along, were not doing so good. and these companies were losing all sorts of money left, right, and sideways for running passenger trains, and they needed to liquidate, and they needed to liquidate fast. And all of a sudden, all these passenger cars start getting thrown to the side, and thankfully, Ringling Brothers just so happened to be looking for rolling stock, and they just started buying up anything that they could get their hands on from, secondhand from these railroad companies. So the first batch of new cars they started picking up were former, sleepers from the New York Central, from the Seaboard Coastline, from Southern Pacific, from the Pennsy. And then they scored big in the late 60s, early 70s from the Union Pacific, and they started bringing in all these cars, just this like parade of Union Pacific passenger cars and baggage cars and sleepers. And I actually have found pictures of the funeral train pulled by Frisco engines of just these long lines of Union Pacific passenger cars going to Florida to be utilized by the circus. So that played a part in the research, knowing, okay, what type of cars did Ringling have? So you have to break. So then it's like, okay, now I got to break it down to car by car. And I said, okay, what did they use for the stock cars? So in the early years, circuses would use wooden modified box cars or modified stock cars for the animals. In the modern era, Ringling Brothers got a hold of Union Pacific's big 85-foot baggage cars. The baggage cars are like the exact same length as the passenger cars. And they saw these and they noticed, ooh, these have 6-axle trucks. And they were built specifically for hauling heavy loaded trains of mail. And they saw, ooh, those would be perfect for the elephants. So for anyone wondering what the stock cars are, they are former Union Pacific baggage cars, specifically the 85-foot cars with the 6-axle trucks. So then I had to say, okay, does anyone manufacture a Union Pacific 85-foot baggage car? And yes, Walters produces that baggage car. So I said, perfect. That's what I'm going to buy for the stock cars. And then I had to go through all these pictures of Ringling Brothers passenger cars. And I said, okay, what looks like that? What car is that? And I had to go through any kind of archives that I could. Then for anybody who wants to build the train yourself, the best reference or best website you can go to get information about the train is a website called, I think it's called Acadian, but it goes under the name Themed Trains. And they dive into the history of all different types of themed trains, from the Orient Express to the Freedom Train, to all these fan trips and specials. And one area of interest they do is the Circus train. And they have a full list of every single car that Ringling had and where it came from, when it was built and what it was originally used for, and how Ringling Brothers modified it when they got it. And I took those pictures and I said, okay, this car is a Pennsy, roomette car, like a 21 roomette car. Does anybody manufacture that? Yes, Walters manufactures that. Okay, good. The next car, a Baltimore, Ohio 16-4 slumber car. Does anybody make that? Yes, Walters makes that. Okay. 10-6 sleepers. Yes, Walters makes those. 44-seat Union Pacific coaches. Yes, Walters makes those. So I was like, okay, perfect. So I start making this list of all the different cars, saying, okay, like these are the cars. These are going to be the baseline for the cars that I'm going to turn into the Ringling cars. And then I started recording, okay, well, how much do these cars cost? And I would have a list of all the prices of all the cars. And then I get into the flat cars, and I say, okay, well, what did Ringling use for flat cars? Well, they pretty much just use very standard 89-foot, like TTX, like, flat cars that you would see like as the base of like a bi-level or like an auto rack. And I said, okay, I noticed that the Ringling cars have like these skirtings on the sides so that when the wagons are being loaded, that they don't go flying off the side of the flat car. So I was able to find these Athearn 89-foot flat cars that had like the flanges on the sides, so that I could turn those into the flat cars. And then I just had to kind of go through and say, okay, like, the big, the box car, like the container cars, like these big, long containerized cars that Ringling had, how am I going to build those? And I said, okay, well, they took these like 40-foot containers and they just like bridged them together with like metal, and they just built this big, long, like container car. And so, okay, I knew I needed like a flat car and some containers. And then for the wagons, I really just had to eyeball and say, okay, like what could I find that looks like that? And I came across Athearn 20-foot smooth side containers, which I know unfortunately the audience isn't going to be able to see them, but here's one right here, which is just like a standard Athearn smooth side container. It says Japan line on it, but this would become the basis for the Ringling wagons. So I put this whole list together and I knew, okay, this is how I'm going to build it. And this is kind of what order and what I need to buy. And the other question I get asked is like, okay, well, how many cars, should the train be? Well, the real train, the actual Ringling train, both trains, because remember there were two trains. There was a red train and a blue train. How many cars was each train? Well, that all depends on the year. If you go back to the 1970s and the 1980s, the trains were significantly smaller, roughly about 40 cars. By the end, they were about 50 to 60 cars. So I thought to myself, like, there's no way if I were to build a 60-car train and each car's like a foot long, that train's going to be like 60-something feet long. There's no way I'm really going to be able to model that or run that on like a standard layout, even a large one. So I said, okay, I got to compromise here. How can I compromise? And, when it comes to model railroads, there's no one that I really know of that can model a railroad feet by feet, mile by mile in HO scale. A lot of people will just take like a large, like 100-mile long railroad and compress it into a smaller, size. So I said, okay, well, what I have to do is I have to take the circus train, the 60 cars, and I have to compress it to that smaller size. So I said, okay, instead of it being 64 cars, let's have it be 32 cars. And I said, okay, that sounds more reasonable. That sounds like something that would be easier to accomplish because not only was I planning to build this train, but being a model railroader, I wanted to run it. I wanted to run this train. And I didn't want it to just sit up in a display case for my personal enjoyment because I wasn't going to get anything out of that. And no one was going to be able to enjoy that. I wanted this thing to be out running where people could see it and enjoy it. So I said, this train has to be able to run. So if it's going to do that, it's got to be smaller so that it can fit on any layout. Not only that, but it will be able to run without like derailing everywhere. Sure. So that's kind of how it initially began in terms of the research. And as I began to build the train and as I started to kind of put things together, that's when I really started to kind of ask the questions, okay, well, what was the circus like for the performers living on the train? What was it like for them? Because not only is it the train that I'm modeling, it's the lifestyle, it's the people on the train that I'm modeling as well. I'm representing. So I said, okay, look, well, what's it like for them? Like, what is it like riding the train? What's it like for these people? What's the show like? What's the environment like? What was it like before, like when my grandfather was around or when his father was around? So as I began to build that train, that's when my appreciation and my passion for the circus began to blossom. As I learned and as I talked with people who knew about the circus train, people who had worked for Ringling Brothers, that's when I really started to understand and have an appreciation for the circus as it was. And I was able to meet a lot of great people who had worked for the train. And through them, I was able to learn even more about the train and what it was like and what the cars were like and all the, in like the very fine details. One person who I accredit for giving me probably the most research and the most information is a man by the name of Rhett Coates. He worked on the Red Unit in the 1980s, and he was with Ringling Brothers all the way until the very end. And in fact, he was actually one of the people who got to physically close the curtain on the final show in Uniondale, New York. Wow. And he had all these fond memories, of the train, and he was able to share with me all sorts of information. He's just an encyclopedia of knowledge. He knows everything about every single car, where it came from, how old it is, all the things that Ringling did to them, and he has been just an absolute asset when it came to building this train, knowing exactly what cars, what things looked like, etc. And interior wise, like what the interiors looked like, because I didn't know what the interiors looked like on this train. So he was a great asset to have in terms of, just what to know about the train. And as I shared the train and as people got to see it, I also met, other people who remembered the train and were able to give me all sorts of different information about the train. So that's how the research really came about in terms of figuring out what type of cars to buy and how many, and anything else specific about the train is kind of how the research came about.
How long did it take you to get the train to a point where you were you had a full train going?
So it took me 4.5 years to complete the entire train. So just some quick facts I can give you. So the train is based off of the Circus's, the Blue Unit. So the Ringling Brothers and Barnum Blue Unit. And it is specific to the time frame of 1995 to 2005. Why I chose that time frame, more is because those were my childhood years. And those were the years that I actually went to see the show itself. And it was before Ringling got even more intense with the cosmetic changes to the passenger cars. So I knew that if I modeled the train in those specific years, I wouldn't have to do as much work to the cars themselves. So that's why I chose that specific time frame. Not only that, but that was right before the big mega mergers of all the different, Class 1 railroads. So if I stuck with the time frame of like 95, I could run the train with Conrail, with like Burlington Northern, with Santa Fe, with Southern Pacific, Chicago Northwestern. I still could use those locomotives and it would still be prototypical. So that's why I chose that time frame. The train currently, as I said, is 32 cars long. It consists of the 4 stock cars for the animals, 13 crew dormitory cars, so the passenger cars where the performers lived, 1 generator car that supplied power to the train because they never had access to head-end power. They were always being pulled by freight locomotives, so they needed some sorts of power for the train. They had the dining car, which is known as the pie car in the circus world. Get it? Pie, because clowns throw pies. Yeah, pie car. 1 tool shop car for all the tools that they would need in case something broke down. 2 containerized flat cars, which were used to carry concessions, anything from, popcorn, cotton candy, flyers, pamphlets, programs, the flashing toys that you would see that would annoy you at the show. I still have like one of the little swords that, kids would poke their parents with throughout the show.
You didn't do that, did you?
No. 9 flat cars with all the different wagons. I forget how many wagons I have at this point. I have a lot. And then 1 bi-level flat car because the circus would carry around privately owned automobiles in case someone needed to run into town for something or somebody just wanted to drive around the area. When fully put together in the whole 32 car train is thankfully is easy to remember, 32 cars, it is 32 feet long. And the train weighs just over 16 pounds. Every car is weighted per NMRA standards, maybe a little extra just because of the length of the train and because it's passenger cars with, passenger car trucks, not freight car trucks, which are easier to maneuver around layouts. So like I said, it took me 4.5 years. I began in 2017 and the train was completed in 2021. So in terms of the models themselves, everything except the flat cars and the wagons are modified Walthers products. So all Walthers passenger cars specifically. The flat cars and the wagons are all modified Athearn products, and the bi-level is the only thing that's not either of those two. It's an AccuRail kit. And I know obviously we wanted to mention model railroad clubs. As I had intended, not only did I want to run this at my own club for my members to enjoy, I want to bring this on tour to other model railroad clubs. So maybe, I don't know if you want to talk about that really for a while.
Well, no, I mean, that's perfect to segue in because, like the prototype goes around the world. You've now taken this model of 32 cars long, and you're on your own tour with it.
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, I had no intentions of just building this train and putting it into a display case just to sit. I wanted this train to be seen because as part of my mission of building this train was so that the memories of the circus train can be relived and can be remembered by all sorts of people, not only just people who got to see the train, but people who didn't get to see the train. I'm talking about smaller children and just anybody who will never get that chance to see the train up close and in person. So my intention from the start was to not only have this train to run at my club, but I wanted to take this thing, like the real thing, to be as prototypical as possible. I wanted to take this train on the go, travel with this train, take it and visit other model railroad clubs so that other people can see it and enjoy it. To my knowledge, in terms of modeling the modern circus train, I'm talking like past the tent era. We're talking the modern train, like back 2017 or like what I said, 1995, 2005. The modern train, to my knowledge, specifically in HO scale, in terms of the accuracy, in terms of the detail, in terms of being as close to the real prototype as possible, I have only come across about 2 other people in the country that have anything that comes close to what I've built. There's one guy by the name of Jeff who lives, I believe, in Ohio, who was the first person to build a train of that detail. He also has the blue unit, and he was also a great reference in terms of someone I could reach out to who had already done the train. And then there is a guy by the name of Jan, who I think lives on the West Coast. I'm not 100% sure. And he is doing the red unit. And if you get a chance to find him on Facebook, he's building the red unit and it has come out phenomenally. It's going to be an absolute great addition to the circus model building community, his train. It looks exactly like the red unit in its final years of operation. He's gotten it down so close to the window sizes and, the correct vestibule steps. And, he's got the skirting on the sides done and, he's got the electrical wiring on it. So he's doing a great job. So he's someone else I would highly recommend checking out if you get a chance. And he's also been a great reference, someone else I can talk to about, how you build, how did you build that? How did you do this? What did you go for the decals? So he's another person I know, but like I said, there's not many people out there that model this train, and that's what makes it unique. And that's what really gets people's attention when I bring it to a club or when I bring it to a train show is it's something they're not familiar with that. They've never seen that before. So in terms of places I've gone with the train, so I initially began actually touring the train in 2019 before the pandemic. At the time, the train was only 17 cars long. One of the first places, obviously the first place I showed off the train was at my own model railroad club. But I brought it to the Amherst show. I am now a member of the Dry Hill Model Railroad Club, which is the modular group in the Mallory building. With, we're actually going to be getting a much larger space to build our layout, but that's probably one of the first places I got a lot of people to see it. And, I remember, I nearly choked up on this one. I had a father come up to me with his son and he told me, he said, "You've given me something that I'm never going to be able to give my child. And that's the chance to see the circus train up close. He's never going to be able to see it in his lifetime. Thank you so much for building this train, because if you had not built this train, he would never have gotten the privilege to see what the Ringling Brothers circus train ever looked like." I nearly choked up on that one.
Yeah.
But, I've been all over New England with the train. I've pretty much been to almost every big club that there is in New England. And I've been, I think I wrote it down. So I believe in total, I've been to about 11 different model railroad clubs so far.
Wow.
These include clubs within Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. Those are the states I've hit so far. And actually right after Easter, On the 17th of April, I will be in Rochester, New York at the Rochester Model Railroad Club. That'll be my first club visit in the state of New York. So that's the next stop for the train. And so far, and one of the other pleasures I get with bringing this train to a club is, remember, when the circus train never had their own locomotives, they were always at the mercy of whatever railroad they were running over for their power. So one of the best things I get to do with the circus train is I get to put whatever motive power I want on the train, but not me specifically. When I go to a club, I tell them, okay, I'm bringing this train, but because you're the host railroad and because it's prototypical with the circus, you choose the power. You get to choose which locomotives get to go on the train. And all of a sudden I hear from members, all of a sudden members are like, oh my God, like I want to put this on the train. I want to put that on the train. I want to see this on the train. When I went to the Garden State Model Railroad Club, last weekend, it was last weekend that I was at the Garden State Model Railroad Club in North Halden, New Jersey. I heard from them that apparently they don't get a lot of membership volunteers for their open houses, but as soon as they found out the circus train was coming, all of a sudden every member was like, oh my God, I want to be there. I want to put my motive power on that train. And of course, those who had been doing open houses the most got first come, first serve. So I think so far the circus train had been, in terms of like modeled railroads, like we're talking like Union Pacific, CSX, BNSF, Norfolk Southern, the train has so far been pulled by 28 different actual modeled railroads. So the train's been pulled by CSX Power, Norfolk Southern Power, Santa Fe Power, Chicago Northwestern Power, Conrail Power, Amtrak Power. It's been pulled by. Not only that, but it's also been pulled by 15 different freelance model railroad companies. So railroads that have been created by modelers. So this is, for example, like Amherst Belt Lines, the Chesapeake, which is the fictional railroad of the North Shore Club, the Dry Hill Terminal Railroad of the Dry Hill Model Railroad Club, the Quabog Valley Railroad of the Quabog Valley Model Railroad Club, New England Rail of the Nashua Valley Model Railroad Club has pulled it, Lehigh Keystone Valley, all these freelance companies have at this point now been able to pull the train, which is really cool, and it makes for great PR for clubs.
Yeah, for sure. I'll tell you, it's amazing. And this is the reason why you're on the show with me here tonight, John. You've done a phenomenal job with modeling the train. I've seen it in person. Just an absolute stunning job. But the real reason when I saw you, what I saw was the relatability. Not only, and you're into it. I've seen you in a Ringling Brothers conductor hat. You've got the clown nose on. You've got a jumpsuit. You're into it.
Oh yeah.
And when I see that, and then the adults relating to it, and then kids. We talk about 2017. This came to an end, but you still have kids that are an age that never have seen it, but they still can relate to it. Yeah. It's such a cool draw, and that's why when I saw it, I was like, this is just amazing. It's a phenomenal story of a train that we don't see anymore, but you've captured that memory. You've captured the history of it, and people still want to see it, even in 1/87th scale.
Yeah.
It's still relatable, right back to that father who's sharing and saying, hey, this used to be a real thing. Yeah. This is how they moved the show. And I've seen it in person too. I got to watch it out of an apartment window in Wallingford, Connecticut, Connecticut Southern was pulling it north. And when it went by the window in Wallingford, Connecticut, I was just blown away. The thing's long, so many different cars, variety, just so many things that are appealing to it. And it's so phenomenal that you have captured this. Not
only, as you mentioned, the younger people who will never get the chance to see it, and people who had seen it and got to relive memories. But one of the greatest communities I've been able to hit with this train, and one of the other reasons I made this, was the circus community, the people who lived on that train. And for all those people, wondering about, the people of the circus, like that train throughout the touring season, that was their home. That's where they lived. That's where they spent their free time, and their camaraderie with one another was on that train. And, you know, it's hard. It's really hard knowing that it's gone now, because these people, that was that was, for some people, that was all they had. And I remember on the last day the train ran for at least the one that I saw, the red unit, between Hartford and Providence, Rhode Island. And I still get choked up about this when I talk about it. I was standing on the Worcester Union Station platform, waiting for the train to be handed off from CSX to the Providence and Worcester for the final leg of the run to Providence. And I knew that these people would be, not forced, but these people, they weren't given a ride home, wherever home was for them. They had to vacate the train at Providence at the end of the tour. That's where they had to get off, and they had to find their way to wherever home was at that point. And I'm watching the train, and you have all the performers out at their vestibules waving. And in one of the windows on the train, I see this little girl. She had to be about, I want to say maybe four years old. This little girl and her puppy. And she sees me with the camera, and she starts pointing. She starts pointing at the window, and she starts dancing around and waving her hands all up in the air, and she's jumping around, and she's trying to get, she's trying to get my attention. And I'm watching her, and I'm saying to myself, this is her last day in her house. This is the last day she gets to ride that train. And you have to imagine, she's a child. She probably had been raised in the circus since birth. And now she and her family are being evicted from their house. And I'm thinking to myself, God, where is she going to go after this? What is she going to do with her life after this? What's going to become of her life after this? And I nearly broke down on the ground and started crying, because I was like, this isn't fair. This isn't fair that these people have to vacate their home. And yes, I know the circus is going to be coming back, but that train meant so much to so many people. And I am just so glad that I have been able to give something back to these people. And I'm just lucky enough now that I get to talk to these people. I get to hear their story, and I get to hear all the memories they had with that train. And not only have I talked to performers, I've talked to the ringmasters, people who ran the show. And one of those ringmasters, his name is Kevin Venardo, and he was a ringmaster on the train through the early 2000s, and his father would tour with him. And his father was also a model railroader and an incredible enthusiast of the trains. And he did a documentary series about the train. You can find the DVD of, I think it's called Riding on the Circus Train, or it's traveling with the circus train. And that was a great memory with him and his dad. And unfortunately, his father will never get the chance to see my train, because he passed away a couple years ago. Mm-hmm. And when he saw my train, that brought back so many memories of being with his dad, and his dad sharing his passion of model railroading with him, and then the passion of just riding the circus train. He was like, thank you so much for bringing this into existence at a time when so many people needed it. That's what's really kind of made it worth it, building this train. Just giving something back to those who it meant so much to.
John, your passion is unparalleled. It really is, for not only just the modeling, but you understand what you're doing, and you do it so well, capturing a memory that's all we have left is the memories. And you've done that. You've given, you've centered it around the model, where people can see it and bring back those childhood memories or their lifelong memories, or all of that together. So I want to thank you for coming on Around the Layout and sharing this phenomenal story. Amazing, just amazing. John, great job with the whole thing, and especially the kids. We want to bring kids into model railroading and have it relatable. and you found a way to make it relatable. So thank you for that, and I appreciate you being on the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure to be on the show.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Around the Layout. Learn more about today's show on our Facebook page, facebook.com/Around the Layout. Show your support by becoming an operating crew member at patreon.com/Around the Layout podcast. Past episodes and more can be found on our website, aroundthelayout.com. And send us your feedback, aroundthelayout@gmail.com. Thanks for hanging out with us around the layout.